what is economy? The real economy. This is Libertarian View, your source of decentralized and distributed information. There is a theory about the evolution of human species that says we were the only hominids which survived the genetic funnel. Where does this theory come from? Well, nowadays we have the possibility to sequence and measure the DNA of any living being. Scientists noticed that there is a more variety of DNA among a group of chimpanzees in Africa, a single group with about 50 individuals, than among all the 7 billion humans in the planet. We are much more homogeneous, genetically speaking, than any other primate. Additionally, the study of human evolution shows that until some time ago, there were several hominid species. We were not the only biped, naked monkeys on the planet. There were many other species, Neanderthals, Denisovans, Australopithecus, and so on. However, today there is only one, us. One of the main explanations is that around 70,000 years ago, there was a great natural catastrophe. Some identified it as the eruption of what is known today as Lake Toba in Indonesia, which was at that time an enormous volcano which would have erupted, imposing terrible conditions to the whole Earth, and causing many extinction events, including some other hominids. We were almost extinct in that occasion. There were only a few thousand remaining. Some anthropologists say 2, others say 10,000 of human beings. That small group became the ancestor of all the other humans alive today. This prompts a fundamental question. Why did we survive and the other hominids did not? See, all the species of hominids were quite similar. Same average size, bipeds, using tools, hairless through most of their bodies. Some even had a higher brain mass than ours. So, what made the Homo sapiens sapiens different from the Neanderthals or Denisovans, for example? There is an amazing documentary about that in the BBC network which points out clues that the human beings, contrary to other hominid species, made trades among themselves. Cheap stones from distant quarries inhabited by different groups were found in other, distant groups of humans. In a period of crisis, the ability to exchange and trade may have been what saved humans from extinction. Commerce is not a simple activity. It requires language, symbolic thinking, and the mind's theory to be done. In the end, we only exist today because at some point we were able to create an economy. Long before there was government or money, voluntary exchanges already existed and were essential for our survival. Why is it good to have an economy? Why does it make such a difference? Why are there people who still think voluntary trading is something bad nowadays? What is economy, after all? It is important to note that this is not an educational video. If you are looking for a formal, standard academical definition, like those of universities, government educational systems, or like your economy teacher uses, look that up on Google. The focus of this video is economy as defined by the Austrian school, made by libertarians and anarcho-capitalists. Economy is not the same as market. Human beings were able, a long time ago, of using communication and symbols to create the market. There are several indications that humans, before dominating fire or inventing the will and the written language, already possessed a well-developed and relatively globalized trading market. Maybe that was the great difference between us and other hominids, which also differs us from many other species, even collective species like ants and bees. The market, the ability to make voluntary trades, is what makes all the difference. Economy, on the other hand, is the study of how people organize themselves to produce and consume scarce resources within a society. The market is only one of the means which people use to achieve that. The fact is that there are scarce resources in nature, people need certain resources to stay alive and would like to have more of some resources because that would make their lives better. Human beings and other animals have always lived at odds with scarce resources since the caveman era. Food, tools, housing, sex, they are all scarce resources. There are many forms of obtaining such resources: produce, obtain by donation, or acquire using violence. In fact, most of the animals employ the strategy of being violent, competing against each other for these resources. But not all animals do that. First, there are animals which create peaceful rules through the marking of territory. Wolves, for example, mark their territories with urine, making it a private property with intention of avoiding conflict. Other animals go beyond that, such as bees and ants, featuring complex societies with specific labor division. Without any question, humans went many steps beyond by using communication, contracts, deals, symbolic values, money, and several other elements, creating completely new forms to deal with the fundamental issue of resources, which is scarcity. Since the available resources are not enough to attend the needs of all people which demand them, it is necessary to find a way to coordinate the use of scarce resources, or to define alternatives for society to work adequately and peacefully. This subject, about how money and societies define resource allocation, has been dealt with by philosophers since old times. There is curiosity about trading, money, and how such things work, but it has always been considered a branch of philosophy. Economy, as we understand it today, an individual branch of human knowledge, is much more recent. Only in the 18th century, the subject started being studied as a scientific phenomenon, through the attempts of setting hypotheses and proving or not their validity. Among these scholars, there was a Scottish philosopher who wrote a book which is remembered as being the origin of modern economics. The book The Wealth of Nations, written by Adam Smith, is still considered the predecessor of many of the economic concepts used today, such as supply and demand. It's important to note, however, that Adam Smith believed in the theory of absolute value, a clear mistake which would lead to errors like Marxist communism. So many of its most popular concepts are not exactly the ones defined nowadays. The central idea of Smith's theories is that human beings are individuals with free will and seek always to accomplish their own good, working and trading with the goal of improving their own lives, and by doing so end up generating good for all society. The finished labors and concluded business generate wealth and benefits for all who are involved in them. This is the invisible hand of the market. Adam Smith recognized that supply and demand lead to a balancing effect, which lead market prices to a stabilizing tendency. If there is too much supply and little demand, the prices go down, which in turn makes the demand for such things increase. The lower prices also guarantee that some people will stop their production operations. That ultimately leads to a new rising of the prices, leveling the market value. Note that this rule, already described by Adam Smith and later elaborated by other economists like David Ricardo, was that which generated what we know today as the supply and demand curve. This is an example of a being kind of economical concept. Yes, economy as a branch of philosophy also features the duality of laws of being and should be. Some concepts in economy simply are, something as absolute as gravity itself. But there are also concepts of should be in the economy. Remember, we define economy as the study of how people produce and distribute scarce resources, right? Well, how do you believe such resources should be distributed? Some might say that they should be shared equally, others that they should be distributed in a meritocratic way, and a few people may think that resources should be distributed considering the ones who need them the most. But these kinds of allocation are clearly a should-be concept, not an absolute truth, but a simple valuation, something that some people consider desirable. This means that economy is also featured in Hume's guillotine. A little historical curiosity, by the way, Adam Smith and David Hume were friends. Of course, economy, just like philosophy, has a broad quantity of streams of thoughts with different views and focuses. For example, one of the main distinctions is the one between microeconomics and macroeconomics. It's important to be careful because these terms seem to mean something, but they don't. We normally use macro to indicate big things and micro to indicate small things. For economics, the difference isn't the size, but the focus. Both studies understand that economy is a single thing, seeking only to understand the same concept from different points of view. Microeconomics set out from the actions of individuals, the study of how people interact in the market or other instances to produce and consume goods and services, to obtain the rules and hypotheses and seek the comprehension of economy as a whole. Things like the supply and demand curve are typically products of microeconomy, although they are real for any economy, of any size and anywhere. Macroeconomics, on the other hand, comes from a study of global indicators to try to understand the working of overall economy. The most common concepts of macroeconomy are GDP, inflation, employment rates, and others which allow us to better comprehend the working economy from an external view. The idea is to start from global indicators to reach the comprehension of the whole economy. There are also several schools of economic thinking. The School of Frankfurt, for example, where people with a certain degree of mental illness stick popsicles in their ears and study nonsense like the developments of Marxist theories. See, they can't even save Marx's theoretical basis. This level of mental problem can only be found in people from communist parties over the world, but some still think they can prove some of these incomprehensive theories. Marx's greatest mistake is that all his theory is based upon the incorrect concept of absolute value, from which he deducted the labor theory of value. Another different school is the Keynesian, a group of economists who suffer from Stockholm Syndrome and enjoy having a dominant government like 50 Shades of Grey, except the main characters are old and dumb politicians. As the name suggests, they follow the most pathetic economist in history, John Maynard Keynes. Since Marx wasn't really an economist, Keynes kept the first-place prize in this race to self-destruction. Basically, that moron had several bad ideas about the imperfections of the market, which would bring monetary problems, and suggested that the solution would be the emission and injection of money in the economy. Every time Keynes' plans were applied, it all went real bad. During the 1929 crisis, governments tried Keynes' static to print money, and what happened? The crisis lasted 15 years longer in comparison of what it should have. If they had done nothing, it would have just run its course, just like the previous great economic recessions. The most recent applications of Keynes' theories in Brazil were when Guido Mantega destroyed our economy for an entire decade. Only Stockholm Syndrome or rough sadomasochism explain why some weak-minded people still take Keynes seriously. But not all economists are mentally ill or full of oddly acquired sexual quirks. There are those who are relatively sane, although still with some father issues. Meet the School of Chicago, which features Milton Friedman as its greatest economist, who has always stood up for the minimum state. Friedman understands that the only way society can develop is through a free and unregulated market. Nobody expects that a free market is absolutely perfect, but it's logically deducted that it's a better option than a government regulating something for which it doesn't have any information. Unfortunately, the parental needs of these economists make them believe that some level of the state is necessary because of, well, it's really probably because of daddy issues. These guys are smart enough to realize that governments are bad for economy. Why then would they be good for any other aspect of social life? But we are not here to discuss the economy of mentally problematic people. We're here to present you the real economy. An additional title wouldn't even be necessary. But just to let you know, the other quasi-economists usually call real economy as Austrian school. Real economy has been dubbed Austrian school because most of the first economists without any mental problems were from Austria. Karl Menger was the first marginalist and is also considered the first Austrian school economist. Marginalist is a title given to the economists who don't believe in the absolute value of products and services. Things only have a relative, subjective value, also called marginal utility, which means that the value of something is always defined by someone by comparing it with the marginally better value of other things this person owns. There is no absolute value of things. This seems a little obvious, doesn't it? No matter how much you value something, others may not give the same valuation for the same product or service. There is no absolute value for anything. Nowadays, no one separates marginalists from mainstream economists because everyone already agrees with marginal utility. All economists nowadays are marginalists. The bummer here is that there was a guy who based his whole theory in the absolute value of things, remember? When Marx wrote Das Kapital, Menger had already published his theory of the marginal value, which destroys any possibility of defining absolute value to products and services. Marx either didn't know that book or chose to ignore it. His negligence ended up causing millions of deaths in regions which tried to implement his ideas, which were already proven wrong before they were even published. There were countless failed attempts to implement such broken ideas. Eugene von Bauer was another Austrian marginalist economist who demonstrated, based on Menger's works, that there was no fundament to Marx's theories. He proved wrong all of Marx's concepts. How could such a broken ideology become so relevant and remain so to this date? I would say it is not a matter of logic, but it is because of the feeling of envy. The third Austrian economist was Ludwig von Mises, who was also born in Austria, but nowadays is known as part of Ukraine, which was a part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. It was him who effectively came up with a new school of economy, setting it apart of all other streams and making it what it is today, the only way to effectively understand economy. Mises' greatest contribution was the definition of clear parameters to study economy, a whole new framework for that, which is called praxeology. This marked the true beginning of the Austrian school of economy. Nowadays, the economists who follow such principles are called scholars of the Austrian school or Austrian economists, even if they are not born in Austria. It is important to note that after the Austrian school was founded, people realized that even before Menger, there were many other scholars with similar ideas. Today, the origins of Austrian school are traced back to St. Thomas Aquinas during the 5th century. The ideas are older, but it's important to note that they only gained strength and relevance with the three Austrian founders, especially Mises. What is Mises' central idea? He starts from the original thesis from Adam Smith that the main element of economy is the study of human action. Human beings act individually, seeking to improve their own life conditions. However, these actions, due to the invisible hand of the market, end up making everyone's lives better. How could such studies be made? How can we count on a clear framework of how such mechanism works? After all, you may have already noticed that humans studying relations among humans are subject to personal biases. People have ideals, preconceived notions on moral, politics, or philosophy. How can such biases be prevented from misleading the studies to fail? With these questions in mind, Mises founded a whole new science called praxeology. It stands out from mainstream economy as a global field of study and focuses specifically on the human action. Praxeology is the logical study of human action. There are no human beings perfectly exempt of it, so it's imprudent to rely only on statistics, numbers, and other indicators to scientifically test the hypothesis proposed in economy. The scientific method is one of mankind's brightest inventions. How can we be sure about the law of gravity? There are several experiments which you can make in a controlled environment to obtain the same results predicted by that law. How do we know that vaccines work? You can make experiments with human populations and randomized tests and obtain results that are consistently similar. The application of scientific method in the humanities area of studies, however, is simply impossible. There are no possible and replicable experiments in history, law, economy, or any other area in human sciences. Someone may come up with an economic hypothesis like, printing money is good, which was essentially what Keynes said, and how could we test such hypothesis? We would need a huge number of countries in similar situations which would receive such incentive, and the same number of countries which wouldn't. All that while keeping other economic conditions the same for all nations which are participating in such a test. This experiment is impossible. There is no way to replicate a number of Americas and apply the experiment in half of them to reach the desired results for observations, while picking different countries in different times would lead to inaccurate results. As much as we are careful to consider all the variables of statistics treatment of the data, it is impossible to assume that all researchers will be aware of all of them. There will fatally be some subjectivity in the study. A different researcher performing the same study might reach different results. An economy researcher may study the situation and define the hypothesis, but there is no way to repeatedly and steadily test if their hypothesis is true or false. In such cases, people use statistical covariation. They try to neutralize other causes and assure that a certain hypothesis has a positive covariation or not, thus proving or debunking such hypothesis. But this isn't an absolute form of testing hypothesis. Covariance doesn't imply causality. Unlike the laws of physics and microbiology, the experience cannot be reproduced. Furthermore, the influence of external factors, quality of data, researchers' ideology, can be highly significant in the whole process. The possibility of rigged statistics or conveniently ignored data is huge. This brings us to an important fact. There is no way to employ scientific method in an exempt fashion on social sciences, including economy. This doesn't mean that such studies are worthless, far from it. Covariance is indeed an important tool. I will admit that many of the considered hypotheses are significant. I am merely pointing out the fact that such results must be observed with a certain skepticism. While it's clearly nonsense to affirm that there is no gravity, or that vaccines are ineffective, it's perfectly reasonable to contest current economic models. Since the hypothesis testing is not viable for economy, Mrs. turned to another way of studying the subject: deductive logic. Mathematics or logics don't follow the scientific method either. No one thinks that 2 plus 2 equals 4 because someone tested a hypothesis experimenting, measuring results, and then came to a conclusion. No. The method used here is different. Setting out from pure deductive logic, this is the way of praxeology. Yes, praxeology isn't properly a science. No science in the social sphere is really a science. Praxeology is something greater, based on pure a prioristic logic. It's the only consistent and exempt way of studying economy and other social sciences too. Of course, those biased mainstream scientists frown upon praxeology, saying that something measured by logic can't be valued. In praxeology, there are only being rules. There is no should be in praxeology because it's nature. But this is the beauty of things. Praxeology defines the hardcore of rules. The human social organization may include some should be rules. Therefore, it's possible to add values beyond that hardcore. But it is folly to try to contest the score, which can be logically deducted. Trying to alter the basic praxeological rules is the same as trying to make things float in the air with no energy. The basic laws of praxeology are absolute, just as the law of gravity is. There is no way to evaluate gravity. Oh, wait a minute! But wouldn't it be better for our society if gravity were a little lighter? Yes, let's create a law to lower the gravity to a quarter. Well, it doesn't work. Just as pricing control, communism, and other nonsense like that. These things go against the hardcore of praxeological laws. How does the study of praxeology start? Well, it begins with an undeniable statement. An undeniable statement is a statement which cannot be denied without entering in some sort of logical problem. For example, Mises affirms that one such undeniable truth is the human action is a behavior with a purpose. You may deny that, but in doing so, you would be performing a human action with a purpose, right? Then, by logical deduction, such statement is necessarily true, always. Looks a lot like the argumentative ethics, doesn't it? From this single axiom, Mises deducts several concepts, properties, and rules, which are the base for economy. Well, this is just the first video of a series in which we will explore several economy concepts. All these concepts, properties, and rules will be individually explored in the next videos. It's important to understand that the great contribution from economy as a science was to pave the way for praxeology. Some may say that praxeology isn't the most accepted theory in the academy, which rejects the Austrian school. For those, I leave a simple history lesson. There was a time when chemistry debunked alchemy. Alchemy was the mainstream science because it promised gold, just as the economy of some schools promises to solve the problem of inequality, for example. Poor chemistry was nothing but a curiosity, since it didn't promise as much as alchemy. In the end, it was found out that after many centuries, the promises of alchemy were vain. Today, chemistry is the universally accepted science. Similarly, astronomy, which defines only what it is and doesn't concern with what it should be, has debunked astrology, which for a long time was much more important for humans because it was seen as something that defines the should be. The human being has a craving for control, a natural desire to change things which they often cannot. The history of economy and praxeology is only beginning, but logic is unbeatable. Real economy, the real study of how humans produce and distribute scarce resources, is praxeology. This is the real economy, and this is what we will focus on our series. All the rest is political propaganda disguised as science. Thank you for your audience. This article was originally written by Peter Turguniev, translated and narrated by Arthur Silvani, and revised by Coreia Conká. If you liked this video, please hit the thumbs up icon below and share the video in your social networks. If you want to be notified of other videos, hit subscribe and then the bell icon. See you soon!